more interesting videos that had been put out in recent months was a video by Isolate Pretty Lies that I will put a link to, referencing the work of Robert D. Putnam about diversity. Now, Robert D. Putnam is a social scientist and specifically a political scientist, but he researched the notion of diversity and its effects on the general community. What happens as a result of diversity, specifically ethnic diversity, conflict, and what have you. He went into this with the idea that he would be vindicated in his belief that diversity promotes cooperation and getting along. And what happened was he ended up sitting on his results for the better part of several years because he was reluctant to publish it because it turned out to be the opposite, which is to say diversity in the context of race and ethnicity mixing up tends to break down cooperation. And here's some examples of what goes on. Lower confidence in local government, lower political efficacy, lower frequency of registering to vote, less expectation that others will cooperate with you, less likelihood of working on a community project, less likelihood of giving to charity, volunteering, fewer close friends and confidants in the community, less happiness and lower perceived quality of life, etc., etc. More time spending watching television. Now, I don't deny the results of that. It seems to make sense. People are tribal and people have tribal instincts that are often subconscious and they're not aware of. But I feel that the study left out an important new factor that's been afoot for approximately 20 years now, and that is the internet. All of what Robert Putnam stated in his publication is true. He calls it, I believe, the Turtlian effect. And in this context, people don't get along as well. And of course, it's one of the premier arguments that you would hear from the alt-right. Now, there's a new factor at play, and it's pretty recent, and it's one that, to the best of my knowledge, he's not taken into account. All of that remains true, but at the same time, we have this new phenomenon of the internet. And what we see on the internet is a new kind of social dynamic where people get along in a different way as compared to the days of yore. So let's talk about the simple concept of neighborliness. The idea of, getting along with your neighbors, participating in community activities with their neighbors and what have you. It's true that in most major cities across the West, where you have quote-unquote diverse communities, you don't have that neighborly function as much as you used to. But on the other hand, you do have the internet. I'll give you an example from my own life. Now, I don't really get along with my neighbors in the sense that I don't talk to them much, if at all. I barely know their names, and many people would suspect that of being a pretty horrible thing. But a few times a week, I have a conversation, short or long, with Coltane. Now, Coltane lives in Kangaroo Land, and we're separated by thousands and thousands of kilometers, as well as extreme time difference. And it just so happens that oftentimes when he gets off of work, I'm either just about to start my workday and can delay it a little bit, or I'm on a work break in between work, and we can have a conversation. Now, are we neighbors in the physical, proximate sense? Of course not. That would be preposterous to assume that and to propose that. But in some sense, we are neighbors. We get along, we're friends, we talk, we undertake projects together on occasion, and it is a different sort of neighborliness, a different sort of community, if you will. And there's another important aspect to the cyber community, if you wish to call it that, and that is the degree of voluntarism and choice that's involved. And what do I mean by that? I mean to say that when you're stuck in a neighborhood, which is composed of people who are just in physical proximity to each other, yes, certainly, diversity creates this Turtlian effect, but you don't have much choice. whether it's diverse or not, you're forced to coexist and get along with people, and maybe you don't even like them. Maybe you have this glorious all-white neighborhood, but you don't really like your neighbor despite the fact that he's as pallid as you are. So what the internet does, this cyber effect, is allows you to connect with people that you do have more things in common with, common interests. So in as much as Coltane is a sort of, just as my example, cyber neighbor of mine, we also have common interests that connect us that I would argue precipitated this sort of internet neighborhood state that we've sort of created for ourselves. This is not something that's particularly uncommon these days. The cyber effect, if you wish to call it that, is something that I think is beginning to overturn some of these older models of getting along. And to be fair, I don't see this as a good or bad thing. This is merely the development and evolution of society and the social constructions that we have at hand. I mean, given the fact that we have the internet, given the fact that news is produced in an instant and goes up instantly and people hear about it, I mean, this was an inevitable development, I think, to some degree, given the circumstances. It's not that I don't really see one thing as better or worse, and I know a lot of people would take umbrage with that statement, but I find myself having little choice but to accept the reality I live in. And so people are able to choose the kinds of communities they want to have in a way that hitherto had not been possible. In the past, we were forced to cooperate. It's kind of like being stuck in that office job where 60% of the people at work you don't really like at all, 30% you can kind of tolerate, and maybe 10% you actually do like. And you, for the sake of group cohesion and work cooperation, you just pretend to get along. You don't really need to do that with the cyber effect and with the internet. Instead, you just choose the people you get along with. And oftentimes, these people are diverse, if you will. I mean, diverse in the sense that they're genetically distinct. Like I said, Coltane is Northwestern European, I'm Eastern European, and CS is West African. And, we all get along. And we're sort of cyber neighbors of a sort, but it's all based on common interest and voluntary choice rather than being stuck in the same proximate area where people just are sort of forced to get along. Now, this is sometimes decried as a terrible thing, but I want to point out that the very groups who would most likely excoriate this development and say, well, this is horrible. We don't want this, and we don't want to have this because it's tearing people apart and communities apart. They too are partaking in this phenomenon. I mean, the very existence of a alt-right, just as an example, as uncohesive as it actually is, and so many disagreements within the alt-right and impossibility to define it, these people have sought each other out on the basis of what they would call white identity, something that they've never really defined particularly well, but nevertheless, we'll leave it at that. And they get along, and they can talk about the issues that interest them, whereas many of them might be in the real world stuck in a neighborhood or an area that they don't particularly savor because it's quote-unquote diverse. Now, this is something that isn't unique to me or the alt-right or anyone really. Everyone is doing this. There are new communities that have formed over the past decade, or decade plus, I'd say. Probably not in the last 20 years, but maybe 15 years, that are purely reflective of the cyber world that we live in and have nothing to do with our immediate proximate neighbors, people that we see. Sometimes we get along with them even more than we do with people that we are stuck with in real life, IRL as they call it. People become fast friends, they form relationships, even get married via the cyber net. Eventually, of course, if you're going to get married and what have you, you live with each other, I suppose. But all these things are the result of a new social dynamic that didn't exist in the past. And it's important to point out that in the past, people very much were forced to cooperate. And why? Because life was more difficult. Even in the mid 20th century, things were somewhat more difficult than they are now in terms of amenities and convenience and what have you. So people had to get along. You know, would neighbor Smith watch the dog? Well, sure, and what have you. And to some extent, these things, these phenomena, still exist to varying degrees. So I can concede wholeheartedly the evidence of Robert Putnam's studies regarding diversity. I don't have an issue with that. In the real world, diversity tends to be a negative and creates a turtling effect. On the other hand, it has an aspect to it that has been ignored, in that a lot of people are spending a lot of time in the cyber world, in the internet, within the confines of the internet. Some of us lead most of our lives within the context of the internet, and to varying degrees, all of us have some part of our life that's been apportioned to the internet, in as much as we spend time there, post in forums, leave comments, produce videos, whatever. So it's an incredibly important aspect of things that we can't ignore. The hunkering down is definitely there. But there are also other things that I should observe as well. And Putnam, of course, didn't run studies in this, but you look at a place like Japan, which is incredibly monocultural and incredibly monogenetic, and it's very insular for obvious reasons. They don't have a lot of diversity. It is pretty uniform across the board, and yet they suffer from many of the same social issues and ailments that you see in the West. People spend inordinate amount of time on the internet and doing these things. Marriage rates have dropped. There's the grass eater movement, if you want to call it a movement. Grass eater phenomenon would be a better way to put it. And all these things lend credence to the idea that there might be some other factors afoot in play in this whole diversity question. For the time being, I will gladly accept Robert Putnam's evidence that extremely diverse, which is to say genetically, racially diverse neighborhoods and societies tend to create this turtling effect. But we also see a turtling effect in other societies that don't have that. It is, of course, entirely possible that a similar turtling effect can have two divergent causes, which is to say, in one case, it's racial and cultural diversity. In the other case, it's perhaps a direct consequence of the austerity of Japanese monoculture. And I've talked about this to varying degrees in the past, but the kind of salaryman society, a society where people are just condemned throughout their lives to lead sort of monotone, obedient roles in life with very little flexibility, and ultimately it doesn't make them happy. And I mean, this is just a theory I'm throwing out there, and it tends to break things down. The Japanese turtling effect, I think, needs to be studied to a greater degree. You certainly see this in the context of, say, South Korea, which has a very similar social structure to Japan's. People, both males and females, spend inordinate amounts of time online. I think more than anywhere else in the world, if memory serves me right. And this is, to a very great extent, to escape their own unique and unfortunate cultural circumstances. Conformity, the absolute necessity of social cohesion, all these things. And these might be specific East Asian phenomena that are very unique to South Korean and Japanese society. I'm not discounting that possibility. But whether Japanese or Korean or New York or wherever, everyone is participating in this new kind of cyber neighborhood where people seek out other people of common interest and spend their time with them, albeit through the veil of the internet and through purely audio means, which is to say through conversation on the internet most of the time, rather than hanging out at the bar or cooking a barbecue in the backyard with the neighbors. I mean, I get how that is a attractive prospect to people. and why people would lament its passing. But the only way, I think, to return back to that state would be just to undo all of this technology. And as I said, the very groups that tend to be so critical of this development, they too have profited from it, and they too have created a presence and a community for themselves online that is independent of their proximate surroundings. And so, do you really want to just destroy all of that? Which I don't think is possible. I mean, I think that'd be very difficult to just get rid of all of this. So I think there are multiple factors afoot. We also see several new phenomena as a result of the internet, and it would be interesting to see if there are multiple turtling effects that have similar outcomes, but on the one hand, but divergent causes ultimately. So everyone, thanks for tuning in, and enjoy your weekend, and I will check you out later. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.